Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Discourse. Uh, I am your host, Brandon Sutton, but you know who I am by now, and if you don't, you're going to learn tonight. Uh, Today, we will be talking about police training, apropos of really nothing. And to help us sort of unpack this, well, to help teach us about police training, really, because there's nothing for really us to unpack because I'm not an expert in police training. Richard's not an expert in police training. Adair is not an expert in police training. Uh, the voices in my head are not experts on police training. I don't think they are. So helping us unpack this topic is expert. I'm going to call him an expert. He might not be, but he'll speak for himself on this one. Randy Randall Shrewsberry. Say hello, Randy.
Hey, how are you? And no, not an expert at all. In fact, I think the overuse of that in criminal justice is part of the problem.
Well, I mean, so you're not an expert, right? But you do have a background in police work and
I, yeah, absolutely. And I've been qualified as an expert. I mean, the courts have viewed me as an expert, but as you know, some of the things that we're going to talk about tonight is I'm an expert relative to what, and what were the things that allowed the courts to view me as an expert when clearly I wasn't.
okay. I mean, I had a whole list of things I wanted to start with, but I think that's such an interesting thing to say, right? So, what do you think qualifies someone as an expert in this topic, an expert in police training?
Well, it's hard to say because the issue is that police training fundamentally is broken, and so I mean we have to start from the point of the historical context of policing in America and what its role was in the criminal justice society or the criminal justice field, as well as this continuation of discrimination and slavery. Police training in of itself has not been changed really fundamentally at all. The biggest changes that it's gone through was the militarization, which Daryl Gates brought in the late 60s. So when we look back and we compare curricula from the 1970s as an example to today, the topics that are being studied are really about the same that's being studied today, with slight amounts of some anecdotal topics that are thrown in, like terrorism. Of course, there's more of that kind of training, but for the most part, the emphasis and the proportionality has been the same. And so, for anyone to be an expert in in police training, fundamentally, would then be just an expert in a broken model.
Okay. Well, I mean, before we go too far down that rabbit hole, uh, can you just do a little bit of a favor? Tell us about your background. Tell us about what you're working on right now. Just like give us your bona fides in police work. Just
Absolutely. I started actually much younger than most. I began my police training in high school. I grew up in the Cincinnati, Ohio area, and I took a 2-year vocational class for my junior and senior year in high school, which replicated the Ohio Peace Officers Training Council Basic Training Academy, which is what all police officers have to take. I by the time I was 18, I was working as a dispatcher. By the time I was 21, I had graduated the full academy, which was much shorter than my high school program, ironically. I worked a few years in the Cincinnati area and left Cincinnati, went down to Charleston, South Carolina, where I worked for about 7 years. I had a great opportunity during that time. I worked for 2 different agencies, but I worked in a whole host of different roles and received a whole host of different trainings. So I worked in patrol supervision. I did traffic, narcotics. I was an arson investigator, crime prevention officer, crime analyst. And then who's now my ex-wife, was relocated to the Midwest, or back up to the Midwest. So I followed behind to Indiana, where I worked for a few more years as some non-traditional roles. I did work I worked a part-time police officer job on the street, but then I worked in the courts, and then I worked in community corrections, doing violations and warrants. So that covers pretty much my law enforcement career, but that's about half. The other half, I left policing and went into the private sector as a forensics investigator, and then later became the director of forensic services up until last year when I joined the institute.
What institute? Sorry, can you just
Oh, I'm
expand
sorry.
on it?
Yeah. So we're a nonprofit organization called the Institute for Criminal Justice Training and Reform. We formed last year and received our 501c3 at the beginning of this year, and are getting ready to start kicking off some national campaigns.
Okay. So you've obviously been a police officer in various capacities in various parts of America, right? So I'm curious personally, like, in what ways is policing different in in different places, and in what way is it the same? Like, what sort of, like, the patterns that you noticed everywhere you went, and in which ways did it sort of just differentiate itself from one another?
Well, that's a great question, and it's really a mantra that I speak to quite a bit is that there wasn't really any difference. There were some things that in the South, racism or bigotry was worn a little bit more on the sleeve than what I saw in Ohio and Indiana. But it certainly wasn't that it was better or worse. It was just more because of some Southern cultures. Um, Folks probably felt a little bit more emboldened to be upfront about being racist.
Okay, so with one more question, I'm gonna get my co-hosts and producers in here
Sure.
to ask you their little questions. Their little question that was really patronizing, but no, I'm sure that I'm sure they have big and little questions. But just one more question from me before intro question. So obviously you started this nonprofit, and as by your own admission, or by your own assertion, it is the only nonprofit aimed at reforming the way we train police officers that exists, that you know of, right? That you
Well,
and so go ahead.
there are some like law enforcement related institutes like the Police Executive Research Forum, but this is made up of all police officers, or largely all police officers. It kind of takes this really kind of a two-dimensional view of just saying this is what needs to be changed, based on just improving current models. What we do is a little bit different, because what we discovered is that uh, those who are impacted by these kinds of policies tend to have the least voice in the process. So our organization, first and foremost, is an advocacy and community group that we start everything through the eyes of 18 communities, ranging from African American community to the LGBT community to the disabled, including police officers who have a seat at the table instead of all of the seats at the table. So anything that we evaluate goes through the lens of each individual community. As I always say, I'm Native American. I have white privilege. Most people think I'm a white guy with a good tan. Um, I could never look at a training policy or a procedure and have an understanding of how it may impact a Black woman. And I never will, because I don't experience what she experiences. So that is our primary difference between us and organizations like PERF. And then the other thing as well is that PERF just makes recommendations. We have grassroots activism that actively pushes for these changes to take place.
Okay, well, let's bring the rest of these assholes in here to ask some questions. Richard, you first. I know you have a bunch of questions because this is right in your wheelhouse. So
Yeah, I mean, one of the ones that immediately jumps out to me, or one that I'm curious about, is we've seen in various ways police agencies and unions and departments in themselves be resistant to any sort of reform or change, or anything that seems to cast them in any sort of a bad light. And they've often ostracized or punitively reacted towards officers that have pursued to encourage that type of behavior. have you what has that been like from you as far as other officers that are still part of it, and like how do they respond to some of the more evocative things that you may say, charging them with how they're handling things currently?
Well, it hasn't started totally yet, I will say, because we're really just right now on the heels of our first national campaign. So, we weather through most of that. But what I will tell you is that because of our focus as an organization is about training, we don't get resistant so much about the importance or the need of training. And there's a lot of problems already that exist just covering how much, or let me rephrase that. There are problems that exist that just cover whether or not they're even being trained, which, by the way, many police officers have never been to any training. And number two, of how much training that they should be required. And police officers, I think, for the most part, are always going to agree. I talk to cops still regularly, and regardless of what we replace it with or how we try to change the emphasis, everyone kind of agrees, of course, we need more training, because it doesn't matter what job you're in, what career path you've taken. Everybody is fundamentally shaped by their basic training.
I want to get Adair in here, but first, I think we skipped over like an important, part of the conversation, right? So, what is police training like right now? What is the current paradigm in police training? I think that we hear a lot from people who don't actually, haven't gone through the motions of police training, haven't gone through, the sort of like the minutia of it, day in and day out, of of literally learning to be a cop. And so, I would love to know, what is that process like? From you join the academy to the end of the academy. What are we teaching our cops? What are they learning?
Well, let me first just kind of just tell you the mechanics of it, and then I will, if you like, I can expand on, what was the experience of it. But the mechanics typically are that you become certified one of two ways. Either a police department hires you, and they send you either to the state academy or to their local academy, depending on the size of the agency. So when we see large departments like Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, Atlanta, or even smaller large cities like Indianapolis or Salt Lake City, they have their own training academy. But the vast majority, or a good majority, or a good number, I'm sorry, of officers attend what is called POST, and that's the Peace Officers Training and Standards Council. And so they set by state regulations what the training hours are going to be, what the curricula will be, what the emphasis is, and so forth. So whether or not you were hired, or you can be what is called a self-appointee, which is what I was. I had some little department sign off and say that they would consider hiring me after I got my certification, but I was responsible for the cost and the training. The average today that officers attend the academy is only about 16 weeks, 850 hours on average. So, which is just number one, just without any question, just not enough hours. So even if we're sparsing about what they should be trained about, it's simply that's just not enough time. There's very few professions that have this sort of training, especially when they have the power and responsibilities that they do.
So what about? I'm sorry, let me interrupt you real quick. So what about things like, I think the buzzword we hear a lot is like de-escalation. Cops are no longer taught how to de-escalate, incidents with, criminals, whether they have, or suspected criminals, or people who are in the midst of a crime, or even people who just need, help because of mental illness. So what is that sort of like, right?
Sure.
How are cops taught now, or are they taught at all, how to deal with a threat, or a threat to their safety?
So that's what I was going to lead into is that about a third of your training is based around either use of force or self-defense. When you add in like physical fitness, which is this militarized, do push-ups, run around the campus or whatever, that's more of, like a kind of a boot camp style. But regardless, most of them have about the same disproportionate emphasis on on use of force or firearms, those tactical trainings, that sort of thing. So the vast majority of it is in this preparation of officer threat. And even when it isn't, even when it's a topic that seems more benign, most of the time they will bring some sort of use of force or officer safety issues into it. The next biggest segment of training is in law, which is really only about a week and a half. So about 65 hours on average, officers learn about law. And to put that in perspective, because it's not just just they get a little manual. This is to cover constitutional law, federal criminal law, state criminal law, local criminal law, federal motor vehicle rules, state traffic laws, local traffic laws, civil law, civil liabilities. So there's an enormous amount of just legal studies that have to be crammed kind of in this 65 hours. And sometimes you can even throw in like rules of evidence and that sort of stuff. The rest is just kind of parsed. There's usually about 40, 45 different topics, anywhere from ranging to 4 to 8 hours. But overwhelmingly, your time is spent doing something tactical or, like pursuit driving, those types of things.
Okay. Well, I think Adair wants to ask questions. Let's get him in real quick. Adair, you there?
Yeah, I'm here just dealing with some technical stuff on my end. Thanks for joining us. But so I'm gonna go ahead and just come out with it early on. I'm absolutely a skeptic of police in general, especially in America. So one of my big questions is training actually going to do anything? Because in my opinion, at least in my opinion, as a black dude in America and one of part of a demographic that is seeing an epidemic of police violence and extrajudicial murders, is there can you train that out? I guess is my question to you. Can you train that out? And from my perspective, the answer is no. But I want to know what you have to say on that.
Well, let me first just say this: is that this epidemic is not new. It is indeed an epidemic. We're just seeing it. There's nothing new to this. I came on board. I came on board when just a few years after. I'm sorry, I'm having some technical.
I'm sorry. One second. You're there. We're getting a little feedback from you. Can you mute for a second?
Yep.
Yeah. There you go. Just.
Yep. Okay. I began, or I was in policing during Rodney King. I was down in Charleston, South Carolina, and as an example is that there wasn't a significant amount of training to say, hey, don't do that. The greatest amount of training was surrounding how do you manipulate the media and onlookers. So when you hear this term, stop resisting, that was largely born out of the Rodney King beating. So to answer your question is that more times than not, unfortunately, they are not real responsive about making the changes that they need. I mean, we see loss of life. We see the cost to municipalities or the citizens because of liabilities, those types of things, and they just continuously do the same things. However, there are things that we can mitigate, and that's really a large part of what we try to do. Is of course, there's a requirement that our country needs to re-examine criminal justice from the ground up, especially when we recognize what it's been built for historically. But in the meantime, there are just some simple things that do work, by like increasing training, greater training on de-escalation or on mental health. And you asked the question earlier, now officers receive on average less than a day of training on mental health crisis, but a fourth of the people that they kill are in mental health crisis, at least a fourth. We don't know, the numbers for sure. Non-white citizens comprise of over half of the citizens that they kill, but they receive less than 2 days of training on average on on race, diversity, or inherent bias. So by pushing these things, so as an example, there's a thing called the Memphis model that deals with mental health. It's not great. It's still sending police officers into places that, in my view, they shouldn't be, because mental health is a medical issue, not a criminal issue. But even, some of these little pragmatic steps are making some difference.
Well, I mean, I think that what Adair's sorry, you want to expand your question, Adair?
So, well, so I can appreciate that, but I mean, so specifically, what steps can be done to mitigate some of like in the trainings, what can be done? So, for example, over my 25 years, I've been stopped by police in an immeasurable amount of times. I mean, on average, I'm stopped 2 to 3 times a week because I quote unquote fit the description of a suspect, if that suspect is black or, in their words, Hispanic, right? So if it's a black or Hispanic male suspect, I'm stopped without question. Legitimately, if it's black or Hispanic, I'm stopped.
Right.
I shit you not. Oftentimes, guns are pulled. I've had my house shot, and when we called the police, somebody fired live ammunition into my house. And when police are called, their first reaction is to draw their guns when I answer the door. How do we mitigate that? Like, what specifically can be done in training to stop police from immediately seeing somebody and just automatically saying you're a threat? And also, how do you target that inherent bias that we do see in policing, that we see in every profession, but in policing it causes such a risk to the general public? It is and then honestly, it also gets into civil liberties, but how do you train that, right?
And quickly, I just wanted to mention, like, an example that comes to mind is stop and frisk in New York, where around 9 out of 10 were completely innocent, yet the police all viewed them as suspicious. How do we train, or what kind of is that addressed in the training, or is that more of a legislative goal? I think it's also part of it. But if I know you want to. Go ahead.
So I mean, I think before you answer that question, what I want to get in there, because I think what Adair is hitting on is something important, right? Like, how much of this is something that can be trained out, and how much of this is just something that is inherent to our, our society, our race, our racialized society, and is something that just needs to be better sorted for, right? Like, how do we're talking about training right now, but how much of this is just like how are we picking people to become police is another sort of associated question. Like what are the criteria by which people are disallowed to become police? Similarly, as someone who I'm sure you went through training with a bunch of police officers, you were a police officer. Like, I think would also be helpful if we could just sort of know, like, talking to these people, what are their motivations for becoming cops? Like the people who you've known who have become cops, who have been cops, like what are their, what seems to be the underlying motivating factor for why they want to join this profession in the first place?
Well, let me start there, because I want to say, I can tend to be a bit critical of the police, and I have my own bias of the police, because I become very frustrated with those who just refuse to take any accountability to what is obviously wrong. I say regularly, you cannot kill 3 people a day, which the police do in the United States, and say what you're doing is working. It doesn't work. So we have to, reevaluate from the root up. So I would say that most cops come into it. Number one, they're very, very young, between 18 and 21 years old. About half the country allow 18-year-olds to be cops. We know that age and education does have an impact on an officer's likelihood or the susceptibility of them to be involved in a use of force instance or their own criminal behavior. I would say that largely, but most of the time, just like folks like me, they come in with a very idealistic and unrealistic view of what policing actually is. And, it's kind of, you want to save the world. I think that, the vast majority would say that this is their way of community service. However, the problem is that it becomes polluted very, very quickly. And I believe that starts really at recruitment. As in a good example, is if you look at the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department's recruiting page and then put that side by side to the U.S. Army or the United States Marines recruiting page, the Sheriff's Office recruiting page looks more militaristic. So what's happening is that you bring in folks that have an interest of doing good, that have, are searching for justice, and then you just really kind of just turn around and made them a soldier instead. To answer the point though about what can we do? So the good news is that police training as a whole is regulated by the state. So each state in the United States, except for Hawaii, requires some sort of training. Hawaii requires none. Honolulu PD does. I'm not sure about Maui, but for the most part, most of the cops in Hawaii, or either any of you guys, could hop on a plane tomorrow. By Monday, be a police officer in Hawaii because there's no standards.
That's a ringing endorsement.
If you go to Hawaii, where there are literally no standards,
they'll hire you. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, whatever, they'll hire you.
That was my shot back to the little questions. How about that?
Fair enough.
Fair enough. Sorry, please continue.
So there are some things that we can control because legislators regulate, how, the number of minimum hours and what these standards are. Sometimes they defer to a panel, but ultimately our elected officials, that's who we're able to apply pressure on to make particular changes. So we know that there are some incremental things. And again, I'm not a fan of it. It's just realistic. But there are some incremental things that mitigate some of the damage, such as, a strong de-escalation techniques, like which is seen in Salt Lake City, Utah. They were on track for a record year of killing people. They changed how they train, with more of an emphasis of talking to people instead of just shooting them. And lo and behold, they haven't had, as far as I know, they haven't had any deaths since they've been implemented this program, where they were seeing 10 to 15 people killed a year in the state. Same thing that goes with mental health training, and then just some, very strong acceptance, number one, and the teaching of who we are as human beings. And, we push very, very hard for high scientific standards. So there is a confusion between racism and bias, and but unfortunately, when you talk, especially to, policing is 85% white male. So when you're talking to them and you say things like bias, often they hear racist. And that isn't necessarily the case. I'm not saying that they're not racist, and I absolutely know. I've seen and heard things that still keep me up at night, many years later, that were just awful. But I think I would be being disingenuous to say that it's anything other than just a racist and very oppressive platform that the criminal justice system relies on.
So Adair wants to get in here real quick, but it was one question before. Let him get set up while I ask this one question. So earlier in this conversation, you made the direct connection between the foundations of American policing, which is like old slave catching, et cetera, and where we are right now. And some people, Zed Jelani from The Intercept, think they think that analogy is specious, right? That no one out that the way we police now and the way that the origins of the institution are just somehow are not it's not relevant, right? So as someone who obviously is mired in this, you don't call yourself an expert because you think that's a loaded term, right? But as someone who's been mired in this, you've operated on so many different levels within and without the police department. What is your argument that this is a relevant train of thought to keep in mind when we're talking about policing, like in the modern day, right?
So I say go to the data, and there's clearly things that we know. We know that white drug offenders, or I don't even like saying that term, people who use drugs, white and black people use them at about the same amount, the same amount. Overwhelmingly, young black men are arrested for it. They receive harsher sentences. I find it, a little troubling to even um, try to qualify, that kind of challenge, because it absolutely ignores what we already know. I mean, our prisons are absolutely overfilled with young black and brown men. And then simultaneously, even aside from the anecdotes that we see on TV, like the rapist up on the northern part of the state that got 6 months or whatever, despite that evidence, we're still holding on to this idea that, somehow black people or Hispanics are just somehow more inherent immoral and more likely to commit crime. Just the data just doesn't support it. So is it exactly the same as slave catching? No, of course not. It's not. But is there a targeting of black and brown people? Absolutely.
Well, technically, I'm gonna get Darren here because there's one thing. Technically, you had to bring slaves in alive. If you shot them, you didn't get paid. So, like, it's a little bit different.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Adair, please come in.
So yeah, just real quick on the bias thing.
Sure.
Because you're right, policing is an overwhelmingly white male institution. If you are a person in a position of power who already has the white privilege in the situation, it's racism. Like, it's not bias. Bias without power is bias. Bias with power is racism. But that being said, one of my other questions is how would police feel about community policing, right? Like, so if we started saying, if you want to be a cop in this area, you need to either A, live in this area, or B, have come from this area. Because, I mean, so I lived south of Seattle, about 30 miles south, in the city of Tacoma, which is one of the overwhelmingly black cities in Washington, one of the few that has a large black population and person of color population in general. And I remember seeing this dude who lived down the block from me, who worked as a cop in Shoreline, which is about 60 miles to the north. It's in the northern part of Seattle.
Mm-hmm.
Tacoma, and one of the only affluent white neighborhoods of Tacoma, but worked in predominantly working class, very poor, and again, more people of color in that area, in Shoreline. I think that's one of the major issues in policing. So how do we transition? Because right now we're just like, oh, we'll take whoever, wants to work for us, and you can live wherever. But if you're not policing the community you're a part of, basically you're just part of an occupying force. So how do we work on that?
So let me say this about community policing. First off, it is a mitigating program again. So it isn't, there isn't anything that's just the magic wand. I mean, I remind folks, as I was reminded recently, community policing was built by the FBI. So, just that concept, just that program in of itself should be met with a little bit of skepticism. But I want to go back to what I talked about in recruiting, as we talked about this differences between, even like the LA County Sheriff's Department, their recruiting page. So one of the problems is the resistance about community policing is coming because that's not what they were hired to do. So, they signed up because with, maybe some good in their heart that they want to do well, but the bells and whistles of drive a tank or, ride in a boat and do all of this, rappel off buildings that, statistically just never happens in your career. That's what they've been signed up to do. So the resistance, and that even goes back to the question that was first asked about what is the response from police to our organization, is it's a little difficult to say because those who, if you went out and recruited alpha males who are more judged based on their physical abilities to run, to fight, to shoot, and then all of a sudden tell them, and so that, that's the perfect candidate for them, and then all of a sudden say, well, we need to put more emphasis on your social work part of your duties, or a community outreach, those types of things. That's where you see such great resistance. But we do know, again, that, and this is, the parts that make me want to jab myself with a fork, is we know that community policing does work. There's better, number one, there's less use of force, less liability, so that saves the community not only in loss of life or injury, but also as taxpayers. We know that it improves relations, so crime rates go down, solve rates go up. If you have a good relationship with people, and you need an informant, they're more likely going to come to you if you have a relationship with them. Yeah, I know. But that being said, is that there's two things that we view have to happen. Number one is we have to band-aid wherever we can. But this is all underlying that we have to fundamentally change how we're training police officers and exactly what their roles are. If they're going to be going to calls in which someone is having a mental health crisis, you can't learn enough about the human brain in 16 hours or 8 hours. It's the advanced class for crisis intervention for mental health to be an instructor is 2 days long. It's just not enough. So we have to, we at least have to get to a reasonable starting point before we can even start making some fundamental changes.
Was just one
real quick, Brent. I got one last kind of big question.
Is it gonna be snarky? Because I have real questions.
It's none of these are meant to be snarky, but they're actually it's actually something that I'm concerned about, because you did mention trying to build better ties with the communities, especially communities that really need these are the ones that are over policed, Black and brown communities.
Sure.
But there's very much a prevailing thought, and I absolutely am one of the people that subscribes to it, of fuck the police. Just generally speaking,
sure,
as an institution and as individuals.
Right.
So how can police do that? Because you've outlined right how they recruit their candidates, who they want them to do, and kind of what they're built up to be. They're built up to be this warrior as opposed to a community servant. So how would you suggest, other than the general training, other than we need to focus on this and find better candidates, what would you tell police officers that are hearing this? Because I'm sure some will. And some are going to be really offended by the kind of things that I know I've said. But again, fuck them, right? How would you suggest that they build a better ties with their communities? Because you got cities like Chicago, you've got cities like Seattle, where we're having cops that are under a consent decree murdering Charlena Lyles in front of her children. We're not seeing any substantive change.
So the very first thing they can do is understand why people are saying fuck the police, and why that's not an unfair characterization. I might not be able to say it, but I can say fuck this attitude of not recognizing the damages that are being caused, the dead bodies that have been left behind, this absolute dehumanization and lack of empathy. What I would say to the individual officer is be a conscientious take a stance of conscientious objective. Sorry, I was tying my words. And I wish I had. And so I'm a little bit of a hypocrite and for not doing so. I learned my lesson in my second year of policing about talking out. I caught a sergeant stealing a pornographic tape out of a car I had impounded, an old VHS tape. I reported him. Me and another officer reported him. 3 days later, I was fired. So that sent a very, very hard shot across the bow to say, if you speak out, this is what's going to happen. So unfortunately, I fell to that, and we as humans are self-preservationists. This is my career. This is how I'm feeding my child. So, and when you're only viewing the world versus good people and bad people, of course, fuck them. If that means that I have to throw something down or not say something to someone else, I never threw anything down ever in my career. I never planted, certainly never intentionally abused anyone. Have I, treated people like a jackass? That I was a jackass? Absolutely. And I, very ignorant platitudes like, well, you should have thought of that, and this lecherous, this morality policing. So recognizing that there is a legitimate reason why. And I will say this is that, and I had a discussion with a police officer yesterday, or a former police officer who's also an advocate, and he talks a lot about the moral and spiritual sacrifices that police officers are making when they don't speak out. But we need them to.
No, I definitely agree. And so I think that, oftentimes, and soon we're going to have to transition to the better half of the show, but we still have about 5 minutes
Yeah, I
left.
want to just get one in
but-
before, but go ahead and continue.
Yeah, but so oftentimes, we hear people say all cops are bad as, ACAB, ACAB, and, that's a very divisive statement, right? And I think that some people, as Adair so eloquently quoted NWA, fuck the police. But, like the idea that all cops are bad, where it has its merit is in what you've basically described, like this thin blue line, right? There's like this blue wall of protection where cops are either conditioned by sociality and or this gang mentality that people have sort of ascribed to cops. Like cops have a gang mentality, the same that you'd see in any sort of street gang, but they just been made wards of the law or whatever, or they actively choose not to, police themselves or each other. And so I guess my question is, it's just like how much of that, and you described it a little bit already, but I want you to expand a little bit. How much of that do you see, right? Like the idea that individual cops, range in moral fiber, but the system itself encourages you not to essentially not to snitch on each other.
Essentially the same problem that they say that they're having with the communities that they're trying to police.
I'm not going to snitch regardless. I don't care how reformed they get. Like,
Yeah.
I'm with Brandon on that one.
No. But please go ahead.
Well, and I'd say I don't necessarily blame you. Well, first off, and to steal a little thunder for, if I can throw in a plug, I'm working on a book right now, and the working title is No Good Cops. And the reason.
Great title.
Yeah.
That's a great title.
Well, I just thought of it moments ago, but no, I'm just kidding. But that isn't an indictment on the individual. So you're absolutely right to say that there is a range. I mean, I've seen officers who, they just don't care. I mean, it's, they are drunk in the power of it all. Or officers who, were well intended to begin, and you just kind of slide down this path. It's impossible to be good in this system. It's impossible because of the culture and the means in which how they're trained. And the training element is that there is this decisiveness or divisiveness, I'm sorry, between the policing and the community. So it's taught in ridiculous, simplistic abstracts of good people versus bad people. And when you spend, even though it is only 10, 12 weeks, 16 weeks, depending on which academy you go to, and you are barraged just over and over and over with what is actually anecdotal information of, here's a black guy who, came out of the woods and attacked an officer or whatever. Then this callousness, and then you're placed in all African American or all impoverished areas to police. I mean, that's part of the problem with even talking about crime, is we don't know where crime is. We just know where the police are. So
So we're going to run out of time for the live portion. We're gonna come back after a small musical break. But I want to let Richard ask our last live question. So Richard, just come in here real quick for Randy, and then we'll transition, right?
Yep. I just wanted to ask, because I know you said a lot of good things, and I can only imagine what you saw working as a traffic narcotics or in that area. I can only imagine. But what I was curious about is, you mentioned wanting to take a scientific approach, and I think that's something that will definitely appeal to at least people like Adair in particular. But one of the problems I see with that is when we're looking at statistics, as we saw with how many people cops were killing every year, we found out that what we were finding, what we were hearing from the FBI was not matching up with what was actually transpiring. And so between not accounting for ethnicity or just guesstimating and various aspects of that in the statistics, how important is improving and gathering the statistics to your organization's goals and initiatives and drives?
Well, it's absolutely critical, and what I would say is to your point, one of the things that that we do focus on. And if I can just do, somebody can be a sacrificial lamb here, that I can give a really quick quiz, just 2 questions about perception. So, someone who maybe not read a lot about this among the 3 of you, is there one of you that would say that least important? Okay.
I'm the least informed about everything. So,
all right. So how many police officers? There's 750,000 cops that work on the street. About another 150,000 that work, between FBI and federal agencies. How many? And they have about 65 million interactions with the public a year. How many cops do you think, on average, annually, are killed feloniously, meaning that they were murdered? Not like a slip and fall or a drowning.
Let's say 1,000.
And then how many people do you think are killed by the police?
Let's say so you said 650 interactions or 650,000 or
5 million interactions.
5 million. Okay. Let's say ballpark 100,000.
That's a bit high. So there's.
I'm a bit high. No, but please go ahead.
Give me a few minutes. I'm in California, so yeah, adamantly against the drug war, by the way. On
We're
average,
gonna talk about that when we come back, because I want to know how many. I want to know how many cops get high on their own stash.
But 53 on average cop dies. Police die feloniously every year. Only 53. That's it doesn't even crack the top 10 of the most dangerous professions. But we're working to study this and see how training impacts this. And the loose work that we've done so far, the informal gatherings of data, I've had one police officer who studies this be close, and she guessed 50. The next number from there was 162. The next from there was 300, and it went up to 3,000. So they themselves are being taught that there is this, great amount of danger, and it's lurking around the moment, in the bushes at every moment. On average, the cops kill about 1,500 that we know of. It could be twice that. We don't know. The FBI, in their wisdom, years ago, realized that we needed to track what lighting conditions even were for police officers when they are killed, but it didn't occur to them to count the number of people that the police have killed. And so Obama had instituted it, and I believe Sessions has reversed that data gathering. So, so we're going to have to rely on outside organizations that's been doing, making really strong work on data collection.
Well, I mean, like George W. Bush, Jeff Sessions doesn't care about black people. So.
No, Jeff Sessions cares a lot about black people, just not in the,
not in the way we'd like him to.
So we're going to transition into the better half of the show. For those of you, thank you for those of you who joined us for the live portion, and try to catch the latter half when it's posted in the next few days. Thank you, Benjamin Dixon, for allowing us to be on your channel, and I hope you enjoyed the first part conversation. Take us out, Rich.
Like, share, subscribe.